Welcome to Glass Crafters.
Hi, my name is Donna and I work for Glass Crafters Stained Glass. And today I'm going to show you a little bit about constructing a copper foil stained glass panel. This is the panel we're going to work on today. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the whole process. The first thing is about cutters. And we usually use a carbide glass cutter. There are a couple of different ones. These have a little wheel on the edge that has to move. If the wheel does not move, the cutter is no good to you. Some of these cutters are made so that you can put oil in them, or what you can do, like I do, I have a can that has cutting oil in the bottom and I keep my cutter in here all the time. And that keeps the wheel lubricated. So when you're doing your glass cutting, lots of different ways you can hold your glass cutter. You can hold, especially a pistol grip cutter, you can hold it like this. You can hold it like this with your hands if you have trouble with your hands. There's a pencil grip glass cutter. You can hold it, the traditional method is in between your fingers, or you can hold it like a pencil, whatever is comfortable for you and whatever gets the work done. Okay, I happen to use an older cutter. This cutter handle is probably at least 30 years old, but I happen to like the feel of this one. And I'm going to start cutting on a piece of cathedral glass. Cathedral glass is glass that you can see through, as opposed to opalescent glass, which you cannot see through. Okay, cathedral glass gets its name from, used to be in the cathedrals, and this is machine-made glass, and it has a rough side, rough texture, and I'm always going to try to cut on the smoother texture. So what I'm going to do is put some pressure in through my hands, my arm, pull the cutter towards me, and go right off onto the cutting surface. Okay, so I have a score line here, and you can use your cutter. You'll learn how to, the pressure that you're going to need on here. Sometimes if you're really pressing down, that's score line. If you you've pressed too hard, you've applied too much pressure, you'll see little shards of glass coming up at you, and the glass score line is very, very obvious to you. You don't want those shards coming up at you. Okay, so when you go to break your glass, what you're going to be doing is applying pressure on either side of the glass. You want to hold your hands in fists. You don't want to grab the glass with your fingers here. Always want to grab it in fists and pretend that you're breaking a thick piece of dark chocolate, so it's up and away from you. Okay, so I'm going to start cutting out my pattern. This has some curves in it. A couple of straight lines also, so I'll show you how to do that. I'm using a marking pen, and I've made my pattern on, it's almost like manila folder paper. It's a nice paper to use as your pattern because you can reuse it. And you'll notice every once in a while I dip my cutter into my cutting oil just to lubricate the wheel a little. I'm going to break this down a little bit. Since I have some straight edges, I'm going to use a straight edge guide. And when you're using this, you have to allow for the thickness of the wheel, the distance of the wheel to the edge of the cutter. So I'm lining this up, not applying pressure, because again, I don't want to go over my score line more than once. And I'll make my score line. Lining that up, pulling the cutter towards me, and breaking that piece off. Now I have a tendency, and everybody cuts a little bit differently, I have a tendency when I'm doing straight lines to pull the cutter towards me. When I'm following a pattern, I push my cutter away from me, and I'm going a little bit slower. Okay, now something like this I can probably break in one piece. If you have pieces of glass and you have fairly deep curves in them, and we always want to have a dustpan and broom next to us to get those little shards off the table. If I'm doing a curve line, or say something like that, I'm going to push that cutter away from me. Now if I were to go to break this with my hands or with the pliers, chances are that this would follow somewhere over here and break like that. So I want to make a few more score lines, and I'm going to use a different kind of pliers to break this out. These are called curved jaw grozing pliers. They have a flat jaw on the top, curved jaw on the bottom, and there are some little notches inside. Now these are pretty old, but they're nicely worn in. What I'm going to do is grab the glass, again fingers out of the way. I'm going to put this up against my score line, and I'm going to snap that piece off. You can also work against the table. Or you can even sometimes brace the glass up against your hip. What I'm doing is giving it a little snap and breaking each piece off. Now these curved jaw grozing pliers, they have two purposes: to break the glass, and they're also used for grozing. Grozing is sort of nibbling away at the edges of the glass to clean up your cuts. And you definitely want to make sure that you're wearing your safety glasses when you're doing your glass cutting, because as you can see with the grozing, the pieces do fly. And I am working over a garbage can over here. So this would allow you to clean up your pieces if they don't break correctly. When I first started teaching glasswork, I didn't allow my students to use a grinder, so they had to use the grozing pliers and really learn how to use them. Okay, but that allows you to nibble away at those edges. Okay, so that's using the grozing pliers, and again we have the running pliers or the snappers that we can use. One other thing I want to show you is the strip cutter. Strip cutter is nice to use, say you're making this pattern. It's good for making long, narrow strips, all the same size. It's good if you're doing anything like a lamp that has grid work, picture frames, boxes, anything like that. So this is your strip cutter. It has a circle cutter attachment that goes on to it also. And right now I'll be showing you the strip cutter part. This has different cutting wheels on it. When one wears out, you can switch it around till you get another one. And what you want to do on this, and I'm left-handed, so those who are righty, you'll be doing it on the other side. You want to set this up so that it, for whatever size strip you need, tighten that up. And what you do is just put your fingers here, press down on the glass cutter, and pull the cutter towards you. And usually when you're working with this, if you get a nice score line, you can cut 1 or you can cut 100 strips, and they'll all be exactly the same size. Okay. All the same size, so if you're doing, again, grid work lamp, strips for here, you can use the strip cutter for it. You can also cut squares. If I wanted to do something that was a different color, say for my corners, I could set this up and cut my corners out. Could also set up a lot of these. And usually when I do this, I have a right angle next to me so that they don't tilt, but I'll go a little slow. They have a tendency to tilt when you do them. But I'll go a little bit slower. And you could cut a bunch of these at one time. And there you have all your squares. Okay, now that we've got our panel cut out, I already have it cut out, but I'm going to show you how to do some foiling. One thing that's really important with foiling is to use a pair of pattern shears. Pattern shears are a special kind of scissor that takes out a piece of paper when you're cutting them. Okay, tendency when you're doing stained glass work, everything comes out a little bit bigger than you want it to. So the pattern shears just take out this piece of paper that allows for the thickness of the foil, 2 pieces of foil in between the glass. Now there are different kinds of shears. These are for foil, these are for lead work. With the lead work, they take out a bigger piece of the pattern paper to allow for the heart of the lead. So you can see it a little bit smaller on here. It takes out usually a 32nd of an inch, and this takes out a 1/16 of an inch. Okay, and that just gives you a little bit more room to work with. Now the types of foil that we have, the 3 most common types of foil sizes are the 3/16, 7/32, and 1/4 inch. And out of the 3, the 7/32 is the most common, and we sell lots of this on our website and in the store. 7/32 is always the one that's a little bit easier for a beginner to start working with. A lot of times people think the 1/4 inch is easier because it's wider, so there's a little more room for error, but I find the 1/4 inch is a little bit harder because you have a wider line that you're going to be soldering. And we're going to get up to that in a little bit when we start soldering. Now also with the foil, the most common type of foil is the copper-backed foil. And the copper-backed foil has copper on both sides. Okay, and this you would be using for most of your stained glass work if you're using opalescent glass, or if you're using clear glass and you're going to use a copper patina. The patina changes the color of the solder after you finish your panel. So you have to sort of think ahead, how am I going to finish my panel? I'm using clear glass, or glass you can see through, so I'm going to use black back foil because I am going to patina this black when it's all finished. And if you were leaving your piece silver, there's also a silver backed foil. Okay, so I'm going to use the black backed copper foil, 7/32 on these pieces. And I'm going to take my piece and I'm going to stick it, start about a 1/2 inch away from the edge. I'm going to look right down at the foil and I'm going to start wrapping it. I don't want to handle too much of the foil because it does have an adhesive back on it, and I don't want that to lose its stickiness. So I'm just unwrapping a little bit at a time, trying to look right down the center of that foil so I can see where I'm putting my glass. Using the black back foil, if I'm using black patina, also helps because if I don't foil exactly evenly, I won't really see with that black on the back side. You won't really see it. It won't be that obvious. Okay, I've cut my foil right before the end, and I'm going to push my foil down. I'm going to go to the edge, and then I'm going to fold my edges over. Then I'm going to do what's called burnishing. Burnishing is pushing your foil down so that it doesn't pull up. So you're going to go over the front and back of it. Sometimes you can even go over the edges of it here, which I don't normally do. Usually it's enough to just burnish the front and back of the piece. And one thing that's really important when you're foiling is if you have a little edge right here that you haven't foiled completely evenly, I call it a little tail. You want to just cut that off with an X-Acto knife, because if you leave that on there, it stands out like a sore thumb when you solder your piece. So that's our foil piece. Okay, so we've got our pieces finished. They're foiled, they're ready to go. I'm going to just place these into my panel. You can see everything's a little bit tighter now. That foil did add some room to those pieces. So I want to get everything set, make sure it's all set for soldering. And I am going to start my soldering. Again, make sure you're wearing your safety glasses. Two types of solder that are most commonly used in stained glass work: 60-40 solder and 50-50 solder. And those are the percentages of tin and lead that are in the solder. The 60-40 solder melts at a lower temperature, so sometimes people have problems with that if the solder starts dripping through. The 50-50 melts at a higher temperature. I prefer to use 50-50 solder when I'm doing foil work. I find it makes a really nice bead, but I also solder very quickly, and I use a very hot iron. I'm using a Hakko iron, or Hakko, however you want to say that, and I'm using liquid flux. You don't ever want to use flux that's used for plumbing work or electrical work. You want to use a flux that's made for stained glass work. And Canfield is usually the cleanest in the industry as far as the solder, so I usually just stick with the Canfield flux also. Okay, now what I've done, I have some of the liquid flux. I've poured it into a separate container here because I always end up knocking it over. So I never want to use a full jar of flux in front of me. What I'm going to start doing, and I'm using a Hakko iron, and I have a wet sponge here to clean my tip off. What I want to do is start off by tacking my piece, and I find most of the time most people have the most trouble with their soldering because they're using too much flux. You'll notice when I'm dipping my flux brush in my jar, I'm really wiping it off. What you're going to do first is what's called tacking. This is used to tack your piece together, hold it together until you're ready to solder. So you want to make sure when you're doing this, I'm putting my soldering iron, my solder down, my solder on top, pulling the solder away, and then the iron. Just because if you forget and you leave your solder stuck to your piece, you're going to pull everything apart. So you want to make sure you pull that solder away. So tacking is just getting everything together, and it's really important if you're working on a really big piece that has maybe a couple of hundred pieces in it. You want to make sure everything's nice and flat as you're working on it. Okay, so I'm just tacking at all the joints. It doesn't have to be neat. And then what I'm going to do is start beading. I'm putting a nice rounded bead on my pieces. So I'm just going to put a little bit of flux on a couple of lines. I don't usually flux the whole thing. And what I usually do is I have my solder sort of underneath my iron as opposed to putting it on top. And I always touch the glass when I'm working, or the foil. So I'm actually touching the glass underneath. I can feel the glass underneath my iron. And I find doing it this way, I can sort of back off if I find that it's puddling up a little bit too much. And I'm just going to turn my iron just up a little bit. If I have to go over anything, I'm going all the way down to the glass, pulling my iron straight up. So I want a nice rounded bead. And usually I try to get it in one fell swoop. I don't want to really have to go over everything as I'm working on it. Of course, if there are wrinkles in it, I will go over it. But again, my trick for this is having the solder sort of underneath the iron and having the iron touch the glass as I'm going along. I'm going to show you just the 60-40 also. I've been using the 50-50. And I'm just going to go over this a little bit to get some of the wrinkles out on here, because I'm just going to show you what it looks like if there's no flux on it. It's really, really gummy. The flux allows the solder to adhere to the foil. So you'll know when you forget to put that flux on there. Another thing you don't want to do is keep your soldering iron on one area for too long a time, because there is always the chance that you can crack your glass. And that's what happens when you go over it. Now if you find that you put too much solder on that, and that's another thing, a lot of people put too much solder on their pieces, you can move that over a little bit. You can actually even sort of pull it off your glass and save it to use for another time. Another thing, when I'm working on a window, especially if something is going into a window, I use these blocks, these are called layout blocks, just to square everything up. I want to make sure that my panel does not grow at all. I want it to fit into the size that I designed it to be. And if it's going into a window, I want to make sure that it's going to have 90-degree angles. So I will always check it with a little compass, a right angle, I should say. So again, if I have to go over anything, it's all the way down to the glass and pull the iron straight up. And you see, I have not used a whole lot of flux on this. That's the one side. Okay, we're going to start working on the back side now. I see one little spot that I'm going to trim down here, because again that sticks out like a sore thumb. And there's another one. Just trimming down these little tails. I always do a little double check on this just to make sure that everything's looking okay. Now my feeling is, when I'm doing a panel, I know a lot of people, if they're doing the back side of their panel, they're not really soldering the back of it, they're tinning it. Tinning it is putting a very light coating of solder, which is what I'm doing here on the edges. My feeling is, when you're making a window, especially say this is going to go in my front door panel, I'm going to be seeing this panel when I'm coming up to the front door, I'm going to be seeing it when I'm leaving. So I want the back to look just as good as the front. I don't want to be able to tell the difference on which is which. So I am going to solder this. Now you don't have to tack it anymore because this panel is put together already, but I am going to flux it, and I'm going to bead this just like I did on the front. Alright, so we have our panel. It's basically finished, and this one is in cathedral glass. This one is not patinaed. This is what it looks like when it's soldered. So it's silver, and if I were going to leave it like this, I would have used silverback foil. And I want to show you what one looks like when it's finished. This one is made out of opalescent glass you can't really see through. So we've got the two different panels, two different looks, same little panel, very simple but completely different. Now this one has black patina on it, and the reason that I like using black patina, when you look at this panel, your eye is drawn right to those solder lines. And most people have the most trouble, I think, with their soldering. They're not real happy with it. So when you look at a panel that hasn't been patinaed, your eyes are drawn right to the solder lines. Those are really sort of the focus of the panel. On this particular one, this one has black patina on it, and that's done at the very end after the panel is completed and washed. The solder lines sort of recede into the background, and the glass is the focus of the panel. So depending on what kind of design you're doing, if you want those lines to be the focus of your project, then leave it silver. But I prefer the black because it does make the glass stand out more. And that's it, our two different panels: opalescent glass, glass you can't see through; cathedral glass, glass that you can see through.